we are ready.
There we go. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. I'm not going to repeat my name because Andreas did such a great job pronouncing it. So it's irrelevant at this point. I know that you're going to see on the very bottom of your screen subtitles. Hopefully this is easier for you to read and understand. I have an accent, and I know many of us coming from different parts of the world may have a little bit of a hard time following through. So that will make it a little easy. To give you a little bit of background about me, and normally I always try to really put it in writing at a very high level, but when I'm doing a presentation, I like to give a little bit of details about my background because it becomes relevant as I'm going through the presentation, as I start talking about different topics. You will hear me saying I investigated, I analyze, I testify, and sometimes you may ask, well, what did you do? What is your background? What is your expertise? How did you do this? Why did you do it? So I'm going to start a little bit of very high level background about me. So as Andreas mentioned earlier, I have almost 20 years in the financial sector, dealing with cybercrime, financial crimes, and many transactional related crimes. In my 20 years time frame, I investigated about 70 cases. 90% of my cases ended up in trial and they were prosecuted. So the person or the perpetrators were convicted. That's a high rate when you start looking at the many statistics of convicting felons out there when it comes to financial crimes or organized crime. The 15 years of my life that I spent in the financial crime sector, organized crime specifically, I work with law enforcement at the local level, regionalized, but I also work with larger organizations such as the FBI, the Secret Service, the Postal, and the IRS. So for those of you that are not aware of what the Postal Service is, they do have their own internal law enforcement agency, possibly about few individuals, 2 or 5, to investigate postal related, which is mail fraud related. And in the United States, it's a big thing because as many of you may know or not know, in the United States, there's such a thing called check fraud because banking checks, people use checks still. So it is really a big thing here in the US. And Secret Service, normally I work with fraud that were cross-border, directly impacting the states and other federal agencies. Some of my cases involve a lot of organized crimes that went from being financial crimes into drug trafficking crimes and then into human trafficking. So it had numerous layers and layers and layers. And you're going to hear me talking about those things. After my almost 20 years in the financial sector, I migrated into a more global spectrum, investigating compliance and risk-specific cases of corruptions, bribery, and then also privacy breaches and cyber data breaches. How I migrated to that area is because during one of the biggest hack of the United States related to Target, I became more of the go-to person when it came to the cybercrime, and another employer recruited me, and my job was solely focused on those type of things. So that's how my background will fit into all the cases that we will speak today. That's how the expertise would take place. So let's begin. Enough about my background, and let's go to the next introduction. Okay, so this is going to be very brief for all of us. So while the world of the economy continues to be faced a lot of challenges due to COVID, right? There were other challenges that we went through in the process. So other challenges included organized crime, and this is the topic that we're going to speak today. During this specific presentation, we are going to go over hierarchy of the organized crime groups. We're going to talk about the profile, the masterminds behind the organized crime. I know many of us have this weird expectation of what these individuals look like, but in reality, many of us kind of don't know what truly is happening in the mind of these individuals. We are going to talk about some shape and forms of organized crime. And finally, we are going to discuss some notable cases and another little jokes that I have on the side related to what a financial crime and the new normal in the organized crime is in the future. All right, so let's go to the next one. All right, so when we start talking about organized crime and the structure, it is very simple. It looks very much like an organization. This is why you look at the structure right now and you say, well, wait a minute, that looks very much like the organization I work for. It is very structured, and it is correct. Organized crime is rather centralized. It's rather organized. They are criminals that have made a career out of that. And it's dating back to many, many years. We're looking at 1800s. And it did start with the mafia, what we call that in the United States. Many will argue that it started in Chicago, one of the most notorious states for the mafia, but other people indicate that it started in the US, somewhere in New York. Organized crime has various ethnicity. Many people will say that it started with the Dutch when they colonized New York. Some of the biggest individuals in the industry in New York City actually were part of organized crime, very hidden and quietly. And then the Italians came, and then the Irish took over. So there's a lot of contradiction about who initiated and why organized crime was, who's going to be taking credit for such a career in general, right? So let's take a look at the structure. We had a CEO, or what we also call the big boss. The big boss normally has two reporting structure. It is the advisor, which also serve as the attorney, possibly. Also, this individual can be somebody that they consult from time to time and not necessarily under their payroll. The controller is the person that handles the financial most of the time, or the budgeting, or how is it going to be moved through. So most of those individuals have this wonderful data line into the under boss, or the person that's second to the big boss. And no, it's not because the big boss is going on vacation, because even on vacation, they are looking into the businesses, but it's because someone needs to be available in the case something goes south. And by south, I mean law enforcement gets involved. Someone needs to take the blame. And that's when the supervisor comes in. The supervisor normally is the person that's in charge of the associates. The associates, as we call it, are the individuals that are running the show on the ground. This can consist on centralized individuals that have experience on the type of crime. It could be gang-related individuals. It can be people that are handling the drugs on the street, that are exchanging the drugs, that are actually doing the work, the hard work on the street to make it go the way it should be going, running smooth, as they call it. These are also the individuals that will take the blame or the hit should something go bad and law enforcement gets involved, right? This is the first individuals that law enforcement will look at. However, when the crimes become more organized and higher level, these are the individuals that become what people call our moles, individuals that will be infiltrating the organized crime structure and come back and report to law enforcement. So they can go either way. Most of the time when the organized crime hire the associates have different and diverse background. Yes, you did hear me saying diverse. Diversity is really important when it comes to this. Some individuals will have a clean record, impeccable timing when it comes to reporting to work. Other individuals will have criminal records. And they do this to keep inconsistency because it works in their favor. So now that we learned about the structure of the organized crime, and yes, this is about 90% how the structure looks. I know a lot of us have this mentality that the organized crime background looks more like very disorganized, but it's not. It is very well put together. And they had to do this to follow where the money goes and to ensure that they don't get caught. It is really simple. There's two goals: follow the money, track the money, and make sure you don't get caught. That's why they need to be very well structured. All right, so let's take a look at what the profile of the big boss look like? And yes, 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 this is a true profile. Well, almost. I took this profile from one of the cases that I investigated and that I had to go to court to testify. And believe me, the first time I read this person's background, I was impressed. My jaw dropped. I remember the district attorney's office giving me the resume, and I'm reading, and I didn't know whose background I was reading. I just thought that this is somebody applying for a job, and I just looked at her and I said to her, "Why are you giving me this? What is how is this relevant to what I'm testifying?" And what she did, she came back and said, "Well, this is the person that you're testifying. This is the person. This is the suspect. This is the person running the organized crime." And I had to say, I was quite impressed. But then as I started reading the background of this person, right, there were a lot of things that make sense and why this person was so good at what they did. So if we look at the expertise below, it says industries, finance, aeronautics, which is aviation, and automotive. It made a lot of sense. This person was really good at financial crimes. In fact, some of the cases that we needed to go to court to testify was related to some of the fraud that they committed within the financial sector. The aeronautics had a lot to do with the industry they were utilizing, or the front company they were utilizing, to launder some of the money that they were actually using during their crimes in financial sector. And then the automotive part was another front company that they owned. So transportation was their expertise. And that's exactly how they were able to manage so many of this. And the reason why this individual, the big boss, needed such a great CV. They needed to study, they needed to have that lucrative background so that it didn't raise any suspicions, right? You don't want to put somebody at the top of the organization that really never went to Harvard or didn't have the experience. It would have looked suspicious from the get-go. And that was something that we did not want to do as the bad person. So then we look at the functional skills, and then we go into the next level, which is digital transformation. That's just another word for saying cyber intelligence. You are committing cyber fraud. And obviously, when we look at the cyber fraud spectrum, it requires to do a lot with the financial part. So the two of them are correlated, very well put together. And then another little level to that is the software development. So obviously, this person had a lot of knowledge in technology. So again, back to the cyber security area and the financial part. So correlations all throughout. And then leadership. So I sat down there and thought, okay, I see where leadership fits in here, because they got to lead all these individuals, and these individuals need to make sure they're good at what they're doing, which is crime. But then as I continue to read the profile, which I'm not going to produce that part of the data during this specific discussion, I learned that this individual was a community leader. What does that mean? It meant that this person went to church consistently, gave large donation, went to town halls. Town halls in the United States is kind of when you come together to discuss the problem of specific town of the community. And this person was very highly respected. So think of it as, hopefully many of you know what Robin Hood is and what Robin Hood is well known for. But I call that the Robin Hood effect, right? This individual was robbing the richest, and not necessarily true, but that's how this individual saw himself, as taking from the richest to give to the poor. He was able to build apartment complexes. He owned apartment complexes in this community where he was able to allow people to live there rent-free if they were from certain background that couldn't afford rent. If they were immigrants that just came to the United States recently, don't have a job, don't have money. So this person was really respected to a point that people in the community knew that many of the business they ran were very much illegal. but never spoke because they saw the good in them. It's really important to understand that a lot of the people that are committing organized crime have some sort of aspect of giving back to the community. This is one way for them to kind of continue that relationship that they have with the community. And so I wanted kind of to put this out there and share this with you because, again, a lot of us have this really strange mentality when we watch television that the big boss is somebody with a hat, is a very thick, big male smoking a cigar, drinking whiskey, and really bossing people around, and they don't know much about the business except for just telling people what to do, delegating. But that is not the case. This has changed drastically, and I keep seeing things evolving in different ways. These people have evolved with mentalities that are all about giving back to the people so that they can be protected. It took a long time to get this person caught specifically. And again, this is taken partially from a real case that I had about 7 years ago, right? About 7 years ago, that ended up going to court, and it was rather large. We were talking about almost billions of dollars in corruption, generally speaking. And this specific individual was just so well protected by the community that it was quite hard to get to them. So on that note, I'm going to move up to what exactly the type of crimes are that can be committed. So this again is part of the examples of some of the cases that I took, but also some of them correlate to what happened during COVID. This is important for those of you that are not aware of what organized crimes are. It can take many shapes and forms. There's currently about 50 types of organized crimes out there. And obviously it would take me months. It would take me a whole college semester to get through all those cases. But I took some of the cases that I have investigated throughout my career. I also took some of the cases that were really prevalent during COVID and that actually made huge impact, whether negatively to the community or in a way negatively to the criminals, right? So let's talk real quick and very briefly, I'm conscious of time here, about money laundering. Money laundering has three different aspects. There's the layer, and then there's the layering, which is grabbing the money, concealing the money, and moving the money, is what the goal is. And then concealing the money most of the time has a lot to do with where exactly are you bringing the money to be able to hide it from law enforcement, right? In the era of COVID, we saw some of the most extravagant ways of launder money, which is pop-up business related to cashing check. Again, checks in the United States are really a big thing. So when we went into COVID, if you remember very much, I think it's very vivid in our mind, many people were working remotely, but there were those individuals that were essentials and they needed to work. Unfortunately, a lot of banking institutions were closed. Many of them were impacted. So many people were paid by paper check. And so what a lot of these opportunist criminals found is that let's open up a check catching place, pop-up. They just got into a mobile truck, a vehicle, and they went to the Department of the State. They licensed this business, and they just linked it to other businesses around. And they just went around to those businesses where there's a lot of people getting paid in paper check to do a exchange for cash. So this is the way that they conceal. This is just one of the way they were able to hide where the money was going. I give you cash, you give me your check, I deposit it into the bank. Nothing suspicious about that. But that's how they needed to redistribute this money that they previously got through drugs, possibly human trafficking. So those were one of the things that the trends that we saw during COVID. And I'm not going to start talking much about money laundering, just a very high level, because we're going to talk about some exclusive cases that happened later on. So we talk about corruption. So when we talk about corruption, generally speaking, corruption has different layers to that. There's the investment part. This is when a public official or somebody working for an institution invests a large amount of money. This often starts with one individual, but as the individual begin to share this, it becomes a rather organized crime, and then many individuals are involved. Ponzi scheme being one of them, where the one criminal mastermind is the big boss, but then the other individuals can be victims, but they are collaborating and sometimes knowingly that they're committing fraud, but very much kind of like, nah, that's not me. I'm not committing fraud. But I think something is suspicious about this, but we'll continue with it. Then we talk about bribery. Bribery is when we take um, we offer a favor in exchange of something. A lot of organized criminals go into businesses to obtain something. They bribe the employee of that company for that information. And during COVID, we saw that a lot because a lot of people were not making money. Many people lost their job, and they had specific information, insider information for money. But then we saw also that the bribe turned very quickly into extortion. That happens when that employee of that company or the government official say, hey, no, I have a family. I gave you that information once. I cannot do that again. And so that's when the criminals came back and say, well, you did that once. And let me tell you, if you don't do that again, I will make sure your whole life is ruined because I will tell them what you did and you'll go to jail and the community is going to dislike you. You're going to lose your family. So that becomes extortion, forcing this person to continue in providing that information that was once illegal, which still is illegal. So let's move on to the drug trafficking. As many of you know, there is a huge prevalence of drugs in the United States. There's no hiding it, and in the world, generally speaking. So drug trafficking can take many shapes of form. In the US, mostly is opioid, which is painkillers that have generated a massive amount of money. And obviously, as you know, during COVID, that became something really big here. But also it became something very special because people were not able to go to the pharmacies in person to steal the drugs. However, the drugs were not being distributed as constant as they would if COVID didn't happen. They just increased in price and they generated a lot more money. Less people were actually in the hospital due to overdose of drugs, though a lot of the people that became wealthy because of drug trafficking were the people that were pretty much crossing the drugs from Mexico. And even that was a little bit of an issue because the border closing caused a lot of problems with drug distribution in that area. So human trafficking, there's not much to say about that except for what you already know, right? This is where the opportunities of people from developing world unfortunately are taking into advantage, and they're bringing into areas that are in need of sex slave or slave for housework or farming work. In the United States, this was actually something that in a way decreased in certain regions, but increased on another areas. And again, I'm going to talk about a very high level later on. And firearm trafficking, this is something that is often utilized for many reasons and purposes. In the United States, when we look at firearm trafficking, we often pause and say, this is many, right? But specific states have a more loose law of who can bear arms. Let's take a look at the intellectual property real quick, which is essentially anything that can be trademark, copyright. We're talking about downloading of music that you should be purchasing in illegal website instead, or counterfeiting a specific product. So this is exactly what happens. And we did see a couple of those things happening. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then finally, cybercrime. Obviously, as you know, we were in lockdown during COVID and a lot of people were working remotely. So why will organized crime not take this opportunity? It is something that it would just not be even feasible for them not to think that we cannot take on this. So those are some of the forms and types and shapes, the most visible of organized crimes that we are going to be discussing further. All right, so let's talk about the how. A lot of people say, well, why? How? How is this happening? Well, for organized crime to occur, many of the following conditions needs to exist, right? So when we talk about this, we think about the demands, the economy, law enforcement, globalization, and corruption. So let's talk about the demands. So when there is the need of products and goods and the people are requesting it, no matter what, I'm pretty sure you heard about the issue of toilet paper in America. I mean, there were memes all over the places talking about toilet paper. This is when, and that's a really good example that I'm giving you for COVID, but there were other areas related to COVID, PPEs, health products, medications, hand sanitizers. So the demands were there. So the opportunity for the criminals was also there. And of course, this is when organized crime will come into play. They look for this specific opportunity and they really, really thrive on them. The economy, when the economy is low or the economic situation is really low for people, low income, there is no job, unemployment, this is an opportunity that they like to exploit. Earlier on, I spoke about a case where some people were doing mobile cashing places. They took on a mobile truck and they just went around and cashed check. So this was an opportunity that a lot of the organized crime were able to exploit in America. But there's other areas that they were able to exploit. A lot of issues related to the cybercrime. So many people lost their job because most of their job were labor related. And so what happens is people became very antsy. They wanted jobs. They started applying for a lot of jobs online. They were looking for jobs, and then they fell victims of this unfortunate situation within organized crime. Corruption. So while corruption is really part of organized crime, and it happens, believe me, in every organized crime structure, there is corruption. While it is there, it is not necessarily a driver to that, right? If you have corruption, that doesn't mean you're going to go straight into organized crime. It just means corruption, right? But organized crime thrive on corruption because it is how they stay alive. So that's why this is mid-level, because it doesn't affect it, whether it's higher or lower. It really doesn't have to assist, but it always is there. Okay, so law enforcement. So when the presence of law enforcement is non-existent or very small, there is an opportunity for organized crime to occur. They will take on a community. If it is a very small law enforcement agency, they will take on that if needed. There's been cases in the United States. I live in a state where at one point in time, we have to switch one of the cities law enforcement agency about 5 times because of corruption. Then we had to completely clean that up and moving into private sector policing to ensure that there was not going to be corruption. Just because there was a police officer or two, there was just the chief and the police officer. So they were prone to corruption because of how small the police enforcement was. It is one of the cases that you see. So when there is not a big presence of law enforcement to help out when it comes to fighting and combating corruption or any type of organized crime, they will take over the town. It has been proven many, many times, specifically in locations where the economy is really, really bad. And then lastly, globalization. The United States is such a melting pot that we have people coming from all over the world. And so trading can become one of those. The needs, a lot of immigration, the culture, the need for certain things, certain foods, certain herbs, certain things will pretty much create that opportunity for them to come and become into this lovely glove of organized crime. I think communities that it's full of different types of immigrants from different countries, specifically in North America and Central America. And what happens is they start going online and they start searching for, where do I get these herbs? And then just by typing in that geolocation, where do I get this herb? Next thing you know, you get this little pop-up saying, are you looking for this? And then these people click here. Next thing you know, a little pop-up market, a farmer market comes in and starts selling those herbs, even though those herbs are illegal. And they just disappear. They just pop up in one grocery store for one day. They rent the location and then they just disappear. And then they go into another. And that's the way that they keep moving without being caught by law enforcement. So if someday you go to this little pop-up marketplace, it's there, but then that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be there next Sunday. It's going to show up somewhere else, and you're just going to know because you joined their mailing list or the email list. That's how those things work around here. I have seen similar things happen in the Caribbean and specifically in Mexico, but it's not as subtle, as organized as it is here in the United States. All right. So now that we talked about specific areas and we talked about the how and the what and the hood, let's talk about some of those notable cases that happened during COVID. And I'm going to go, there's going to be a lot of those cases. So I'm going to choose some of them to give you a little bit of a background about what happened, just because we have some lengthy stories to tell you here. And I want to be really conscious of time and allow some time for questioning for you. All right, so let's start with United States and Europe. So these are some of the most highest cases that happened during the pandemic. I know a lot of people are sitting back and they're looking at this and they're saying, but wait a minute, there's a lot more. There are a lot more for Europe, but there are a lot more in the United States. But I just happen to kind of bring it down to the cases that have a lot more percentile. So a couple of examples that I'm going to give you is the sexual violence offenses. So you're going to see that a lot across many of the continents that I will be speaking about. This is because we are all home. A lot of violence happened. Unfortunately, I'm going to give you a few examples, and the example that I'm going to give you specifically in the United States had to do with human trafficking. So a lot of those businesses in organized crime related to human trafficking, specifically the individuals that were trafficked for sexual exploitation, specifically, they were home. Business were closed. Many of those individuals happened to have businesses that were front only. And by front, I mean they were running nightclubs. They were running yacht rentals, specifically here in the lovely New York State. And they were providing these people to be used as sexual victims for their pleasure. Because of the pandemic, all of those businesses were forced to shut down. And so what did this organized criminal do with these individuals that were victim of that? They became abusive. They became violent towards them. Many times, this violence were reported by witnesses. They were reported by the same victims. Some victims were able to escape. In New York specifically, as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown, many of the sexual violent offenses, they were able to bring the individuals to court and they were able to arrest them because there was a lot of this happening everywhere, and people were no longer at work to not witness things. People were more attentive. They were more preoccupied with what happened to their home next door. And so they were able to report when they heard something, when they saw something that was out of the ordinary. And so that became something very big here in the US, and it started to be tracked by law enforcement. But when law enforcement started tracking this, they realized that, hey, we often get a lot of report of sexual violence, but not to the extent. Also, when we get report about sexual violence, we rarely ever get an arrest because by the time we go to their home, we can find the victims. That was not the case here. You were able to find the victims, no one, but many, as well as the abusers. So that was one fantastic way to put that in essence, right? Not necessarily good for the victim, but good because they were able to apprehend the abusers and arresting and make cases, which if the pandemic never happened, we wouldn't even be able to see that coming to life at all. All right, so moving of illegal substances in the dark web. So the post office became less operational. And so in the United States, a lot of packages that were coming in were not necessarily supervised the way they should have been. And a lot of the organized crime got a hold of that information. And essentially they began to traffic a lot of illegal substances like pills, certain type of animals. And again, I talked about earlier plants. A lot of these plants were actually coming to the black market through the dark web and then into the mail system. This would never have happened if the COVID-19 cases would have impacted the postal or the mail organization in the United States. So this was a completely different wave of organized crime happening, but not necessarily new, just at a very escalated level at this point. Okay, so child pornography, this is a true case, and I'm going to take a little moment to speak about this, and again, very conscious of time. Child pornography, you all know that happens. But something that very intriguingly happened is how it changed into different world. When in 2020, right in April, when I was working for my previous company, I was reached out by somebody asking me questions about getting access to certain documents. And I remember telling this individual, well, I asked several questions, why you need it? This is regulated, I cannot give you access to this. And through that conversation, this person decided that he wanted to ask me other questions because I knew about technology. And one of the questions was, how can I access my Dropbox or my Google Cloud? And my first initial response to this was, well, you shouldn't be uploading or downloading stuff in your work computer. This is why he was working remotely during the pandemic. This is why the company has a personal cloud to upload and download. So you shouldn't be, but yeah, essentially you can use it. But then he started going on. He's like, do you think the company tracks that? And I'm like, well, this is odd. So after our conversation, I decided that I was going to file an incident report and request that his internet access is investigated or tracked for a while. I let it be. I left the company, moved to my new employer, and about 7 months ago, I was reached out by the district attorney's office in New York asking me to testify in a case related to this very individual. And I was wondering, well, why am I a witness? I only spoke with this person once in my lifetime. It turns out that this individual was doing child pornography using Dropbox and Google Documents. What happens is the websites that you would normally be blackmailing with your firework at your company was no longer operational. And so what the organized crime did instead, the group did, they created Dropbox's file, knowing that a lot of people are able to access those files through their work computer. It was quite clever for them to come up with that solution because they knew they were going to be able. And how this individual was able to do this, he will go into the dark web, he will purchase something with a fake name. The criminals will send him a link to the Dropbox with videos and pictures of child pornography. And it was substantially a lot of them. It was so many of them that my former employer decided to file charges against this individual because it was in the work computer, and it turned into a big case because after that, a lot of other cases and a lot of other employers decided to do the same thing based on this case, and they realized this is bigger than what we thought. I'm going to move away a little bit from the United States and move a little bit into Europe because we're running a little bit out of time. And I'm going to talk about really quick about intellectual property crime. So in that area in Europe, what we saw about intellectual property crime was a high increase of that, just mainly because a lot of illegal areas, specifically we're talking about COVID related medicines, masks, we're talking about certain medication that may and may not help through COVID came into the market. And this became something really dangerous for a lot of people in Europe, specifically in countries that were a little bit less developed than the others. Corruption increased in certain areas of Europe. I wouldn't have to mention any of those areas, but essentially it became one of the largest organized crime. And many of you are sitting there thinking, well, corruption is just many countries, but these were a lot worse than the normal cases. So if we look at cases of corruption in 2018, it is 5% less than corruption happening in certain part of Europe in 2020 and 2021, which it was the peak of the COVID pandemic. Okay, so really quick, Latin America, human trafficking, believe it or not, was at its peak. Where in other countries, human trafficking slowed down, in Latin America it became really, really prominent. And this had a lot to do because of the people crossing the border or attempting to cross the border. They needed to get to wherever they needed to get to. And essentially they made deals with these bad people, and then they became, part of the human trafficking business, unfortunately. And then obviously, not to sound like this is something new, but drug-related violence like homicide increased. Again, this only happened in Latin America and had a lot to do with the drug cartel. The movement of drug became more isolated. They couldn't cross the border, and therefore people were fighting for their territory. As a result, there was a lot of violence and death and murder and homicide that affected the country. The same thing happened in Africa. Africa homicide increased drastically for the same exact reason. The sexual offenses and violence and actually prostitution increased. They took this was very new to this area of the globe. This took a new, different shape and form. They opened massage parlors where they also talked about this was supposed to be for the richest, to deal with mental health. And to deal with the crisis that is causing a home. And essentially, this was just a front business for prostitution. A lot of people didn't see that coming, but this just kind of switched to a whole different level in this area of the world. And terrorism, there was a lot of death and crime wars related to farmers versus specific civilians being killed in this part of the world. So this increased drastically within COVID. Some samples can be found in different areas. I happen to testify in court to some of those sexual violence offenses and prostitution last year because it was part of some other related crimes that I obviously, unfortunately, I cannot speak to right now. All right, so let's move on to the next step. So what the new normal looks like after COVID. So this is more of a kind of, in a way, irony for somebody that worked in the financial institution for such a long, long time, right? So walking to a bank with a mask before COVID was highly suspicious, sometimes even unacceptable. God forbid you have anything covering your face at the entrance in the United States to be the most lucrative. But all banks in the United States have a guard or have an actual police officer off duty guarding the door. So if you have any coverage, the first thing they would say is, sir, uncover yourself. But now, when you walk into a bank wearing a mask, I thought this would be a little comical, where now we're thanking you for being such a great person and trying to protect people. I thought this would be comical for everybody to see, because what it was not the normal before COVID became now the new normal. Okay, in essence, I want to close with a couple of things. We know that the pandemic presented a lot of issues throughout the globe. There is no doubting that at all. However, it is important to mention that while a lot of the cases that I just mentioned increased in the United States, some evolved in different levels, others actually decreased drastically. Smuggling immigrants and human trafficking in the United States, in many parts of the world, except for Latin America, increased drastically. And as I mentioned before, law enforcement was able to actually prosecute a lot of these criminals because of the pandemic. And it's sad to say this, but there was some good about this, because otherwise many people would never have seen their loved ones. Drug trafficking actually increased drastically. With the closing of the border, there was no way for drugs to come into the United States. Yes, there was the in-house, but even because pharmacies were closed, there was no high levels of distribution. Firearms trafficking, we all know that the rights to bear arms in the United States is low here. And so because of that, during the pandemic, we saw less cases of public shootings. And that was such a relief for a lot of people, because for many parents, sending their children to school in the United States is always that fear in the back of their head. So I think this has helped a lot to control. But then now that we move forward to the pandemic, we're seeing an increase in each of these cases. On that note, I want to open it up for questions. I know we only have 7 minutes, so I want to be very, very brief if you can. If you have any question, I'm pretty sure that either Michelle, Andreas, or Sam can forward them to me. You can email them to me as well if you have any additional questions. But I do want to thank both Andreas and Michelle and Sam for inviting me. And I want to thank you all for spending some time with me, listening to what I have to say. And I'm here if you have any questions.
Yarisa, thank you very much for your presentation. Very impressive, really impressive. Really, I enjoyed a lot, and I hope and I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. Thank you very much again.
Thank
now
you.
we have say some minutes for some question. I ask Michelle in case if she can follow that part.
Yes.
Thank
Hi,
you,
so
Michelle.
we have one question. I will read it out so you can answer. So the first question, apologies if I'm not reading your name correctly, is from Reno Muya. She says, hello, thank you for the great presentation. Yarisa, thanks for what you do. A case that I know of in New York was about a US citizen of European origin who was approached by foreign nationals on an offer to rent his building to their consulate. They were kickbacks, but also they've requested to use his company's book to launder money for a high-profile foreign leader from the SEE region. Keeping it short, he got convicted, got shorter sentence because of being community sweetheart. My question is, how can the US private sector react on such offers? It's my way or the highway type of deal when it comes to foreign contracts, especially when such foreign governments may have the US employees and certain FBI members on retainer.
Yeah, no, that is amazing. That's a great question. And I believe I heard of this. So the private sector has a lot to put in and say, but then there's also specific laws that take in place. We're talking about an international person. Laws apply differently to these individuals. So if you are a foreign person, now we're talking about extradition. If you have done something here in the United States, your sentence will be reduced. And then based on that, let's say if I understood your question correctly, then immigration, now the federals will come into place and they will take over and then send this person to their country. Now, what the country would do is completely up to them, right? The country may decided that, nope, we're not going to do anything. The crime happened in the United States. We don't actually have any treaty with them. We're not going to address this, right? It's quite kind of that. The private sector does have a lot of responsibility, and in many ways, shape, or form, they have realized that they have responsibility to respond to a lot of the things. I gave an example earlier where I reported somebody for some suspicious activity and went to my former employer to follow through. When they realized that what they found was so illegal in many ways, they didn't just fire this person. They decided to take the opportunity and take charges and go to law enforcement and file charges against this individual, right? Because this now became a cross-border crime and it can negatively impact them. So how can we actually push law enforcement to work with, the question here should be, how can we push law enforcement to work with the private sector? It's a matter of the community actually pushing for that. You mentioned that this person was protected by the community, and it is always the case. When the community has a lot of influence, sometimes law enforcement takes a step back and say, we're not going to do much. He's loved by them. Let's reduce the sentence, clean our hands, and move on. So this is not just the private sector, it's also the community, it's also law enforcement. They all need to talk, they need to play a role together, and it is something that we see very often happening, not in the United States only, but across Europe and Latin America. I can definitely tell you that. Hopefully I answer your question.
I was speaking on mute. Yeah, thank you, Yarisa. I just wanted to add something on that with regard to the private sector and how they could react. I think something you mentioned very good points. Of course, there is a limit to what some of the public sectors can do, and then they might just decide to close on the case. But something that's very important maybe for the private sector is to consider their ethical obligation as a business, because they are there not only to make profit, but they have to consider the full picture. When we're moving towards more business governance, ESG criteria, these are very important, potentially something that a lot of business owners and also a lot of employees need to be educated about.
Yeah,
I think that's
no,
something.
It is very important, and yeah, definitely they need to practice what they have in writing, because a lot of people have an ethics law, but they don't necessarily apply them. So very good point for sure, Michelle. Thank you.
I'll just move on. There's quite a lot of questions, so we will keep going to them. Okay. How can we stop this Scrooge?
Which crew? It's many of them. How can we stop it? So as I mentioned before, it's a lot of the needs and demand, right? As long as we as humans need and demand things, there's going to be an opportunity for crime. Crime has existed as long as one of the longest profession, which a lot of people say prostitution. So it's the opportunity. As long as there is an opportunity, there is a gap to exploitation. So my suggestion is, how do you stop it? Be a little bit more conscious about the things that you want, that you wish, that you need, right? Often I can tell you, I say when I'm traveling, like, I really want a hamburger, really bad. I miss a hamburger from the United States. And the next thing I know, somebody say, oh, there's this underground club. But then I hear underground and I'm like, oh yeah, no, I don't need a hamburger that bad. I'm not going to some weird underground club because I don't know what they're doing there, right? Who am I paying money to? Could this be legal? So as a person, be conscious of what you are choosing to purchase, what your demands are. It starts with us. It is our responsibility. I cannot just honestly sit here and start pointing fingers at bad guys, because as long as there is people like us wanting things, cheaper things, free things, there will be people like them out there. So that's how we can stop this group. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely right. Where the demand is, there'll be supply. Yes, completely agree. Next question. Regarding your assessment of the increases and decreases in types of crime during the pandemic, was wondering which sources was this based on? Okay.
Oh. ACES International it was in one of the PowerPoint presentation, is one of them, the decrease of crime. So if you're going to ACES International, and the other one came from Interpol. So it's very specific. Interpol give you a little bit more of an overview of percentile in Europe specifically, where ACES International actually focuses more in the United States and Latin America. So those sources will be there, and I believe this is going to be recorded so you can take the sources directly from the presentation for sure.
Yes, the meeting is recorded and we will have it up on YouTube very shortly. Next question. In Romania, the scourge persists. Some patients at the emergency hospital from Lassi had stents implant in the heart to be declared dead from COVID. Wow.
That's wow. All I can say, wow.
All sorts. Okay, there wasn't a question on that. I think that's all the questions we have for today.
Thank you very much for your question. Again, you have my information, my email. If you have any questions that came to mind, feel free to send me an email for sure. And thank you both, Andreas and Michelle, for putting this together. This has been fantastic. And thank you to the European Forensic Institute and for the International Association of Tim, you're gonna kill me. I forgot the
crime analyst.
No worries.
You're gonna kill me. It is intermingling.
It will become easier and easier the longer you are a member.
Yes, it is indeed. The longer you're a member, and I've been a member for like several months now, it will become easier for sure. But thank you for putting this together. It has been amazing. I love working with you guys. You guys have been fantastic. For sure.
Thank you very much again for your presentation, for your nice contribution. I hope to have your guests in other events and cooperation with our institution for the future. Thank you again, and thank you to the attendees. See you next meet the ESPA, next event, and see you soon. Thank you. Have a nice evening or have a nice day. Bye-bye.